Chadwick Boseman walks into a high-end boutique to buy a suit, but he is met with disdain and racism by the staff. The insults quickly escalate into open aggression and then physical assault. Within minutes, however, the entire staff is in a panic after learning who their unwanted visitor really is. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The boutique glistened like a glass palace under the early afternoon sun, its polished windows reflecting the opulence of the world inside. Beyond the doors lay rows of tailored suits displayed like artifacts in a museum, each piece a testament to exclusivity and wealth. Soft, instrumental music drifted through the space, barely audible but meticulously chosen to match the store's luxurious atmosphere. The scent of polished leather, cedar wood, and faint traces of cologne lingered in the air, wrapping visitors in an invisible layer of prestige. Everything about the boutique whispered sophistication and whispered louder still to those who didn't belong. Chadwick Boseman stepped out of his black SUV, parked at the curb of Rodeo Drive, and adjusted the faded baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. His reflection in the car's tinted window revealed a man dressed for comfort. Worn jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and a pair of white sneakers that had seen better days. He paused for a moment, brushing invisible lint from his shirt, and took a deep breath. He knew this wasn't his usual style. The Chadwick who graced magazine covers and red carpets would have arrived dressed sharply, perhaps in one of the very suits that hung behind those windows. But today wasn't about appearances. Today was about stripping all of that away. He had grown accustomed to seeing people's faces light up when they recognized him, their expressions shifting from indifference to awe in an instant. But he also remembered the looks before the recognition, the glances that dismissed him as just another black man who didn't belong in spaces like this. It wasn't paranoia. It was a reality he had lived long before fame, and one he still encountered when the spotlight wasn't shining directly on him. Today, he wasn't an actor. He wasn't a star. He was a man in need of a suit, stepping into a world where he might not be welcome. The brass handle of the boutique's door was cool under his palm as he pushed it open. The faint chime of a bell overhead announced his arrival, cutting through the soft strains of classical music. Heads turned almost immediately. Near the entrance, two employees, one a sharply dressed man with a neatly trimmed beard, the other a blonde woman in heels that clicked against the marble floor, stopped mid-conversation to glance his way. Chadwick caught the brief flicker in their eyes, the subtle shift as their gazes swept over his clothes and settled into something less than welcoming. "Good afternoon," he said, offering a polite smile. The blonde stepped forward first. Her name tag read Lauren. Her tailored blazer and perfectly styled hair suggested authority, though her sharp eyes carried an edge that undercut her professional polish. She didn't return his smile. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone hovering between civility and dismissal. Chadwick nodded. "Yeah, I'm looking for a suit. Something classic but modern. Got an event coming up." Lauren's gaze lingered on his sneakers for a beat too long before she looked back up at him. "We work by appointment," she said crisply. "Did you have one scheduled?" "I didn't realize I needed one," he replied, keeping his tone even. "Well," she said, her lips pressing into a thin smile, "typically, our clients call ahead. It helps us prepare." The man behind her, Scott, according to his name tag, stepped closer, crossing his arms. His cologne wafted forward, sharp and assertive. "But we do offer consultations," Scott added. "We could set one up for next week if you'd like." Chadwick tilted his head slightly, studying them. "I was hoping to find something today," he said. "I don't need a consultation, just a good fit." Scott's smile tightened. "Our pieces are tailored for specific clients. Most of them require pre-qualification." "Pre-qualification?" Chadwick repeated, raising an eyebrow. Lauren stepped in quickly. "We cater to a very particular clientele. It's important to make sure we're meeting their needs and expectations." "And you don't think I qualify?" The question hung in the air for a moment, heavier than any of them expected. Lauren recovered first, her posture stiffening. "It's not personal," she said, the forced pleasantness in her voice faltering. "We just find it helpful to match clients with products that suit their lifestyle." Chadwick let her words settle, feeling the familiar weight of assumption pressing down. He had walked into this store expecting tension, but hearing it spoken aloud still sent a flicker of heat through him. "Fair enough," he said, his voice calm. "Why don't we start with showing me what you have, and we'll figure out if it suits my lifestyle?" Scott hesitated, but Lauren gave a clipped nod. "Fine, follow me." As they moved deeper into the store, Chadwick noticed the whispers. Other employees stole glances in his direction, their eyes darting away whenever he looked back. The marble floor seemed to amplify the sound of every footstep, the click of Lauren's heels echoing like a countdown. They stopped near a display of navy and charcoal suits arranged like art pieces. Lauren gestured toward them but didn't step closer, as if unwilling to let him handle the merchandise without supervision. "These are from our latest collection," she said. "Most of them start in the 5-figure range. Are you comfortable with that price point?" Chadwick allowed himself a small smile. "I think I'll manage." Scott smirked but said nothing. Lauren folded her arms. "Feel free to look, but we do ask that clients refrain from touching the garments until one of our consultants assists." Chadwick raised an eyebrow. "Is that policy new?" "It's standard," Lauren replied quickly. "Right," Chadwick said, stepping closer to the rack. He reached out and brushed his fingers along the sleeve of one of the suits, a smooth, tailored jacket that felt cool under his touch. Lauren stepped forward immediately, intercepting him. "Sir, as I mentioned, I heard you," Chadwick interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "I'm just looking." She didn't back away. Scott shifted behind her, arms still crossed, and for the first time, Chadwick felt the distinct sensation of being surrounded. It wasn't the overt hostility he had experienced in his youth, back when insults were shouted rather than disguised, but it was just as sharp, the kind of exclusion wrapped in politeness, designed to cut without leaving marks. Chadwick stepped back from the suit and slid his hands into his pockets. "All right," he said. "What would you recommend for someone like me?" Lauren blinked, momentarily thrown by the question. Then her polite mask slipped back into place. "Maybe something a little more understated," she said. "I can show you some options in a more accessible price range." Scott smirked again. Chadwick said nothing, letting the moment stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. "Lead the way," he said finally. As Lauren turned and walked toward the back of the store, Chadwick followed, his footsteps echoing behind hers. He could feel Scott's gaze on his back, and with every step the tension thickened. He wasn't here to make assumptions, he was here to observe. But already it was clear. This was going to be more than just an ordinary shopping trip. The air in the boutique seemed colder as Chadwick followed Lauren through the sleek, marbled showroom. The soft clicking of her heels echoed with each step, a sharp contrast to the muffled sound of his sneakers against the polished floor. Scott trailed behind them, his presence like an unwanted shadow. Chadwick couldn't help but notice how the space seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though the walls themselves were leaning in to watch the unfolding drama. Rows of mannequins stood like sentinels in the periphery, draped in the finest fabrics and tailored to perfection. Their smooth, faceless heads seemed to mock him as he passed, as though they had already decided he didn't belong. Yet Chadwick kept his posture steady, his hands still tucked into his pockets, feigning indifference even as the tension crept along his spine. Lauren stopped abruptly near a display of muted grays and charcoal blacks. She turned, her sharp features betraying the faintest flicker of annoyance before her professional mask snapped back into place. "These pieces are part of last season's collection," she said, gesturing to the suits hanging neatly on gold-plated racks. "More accessible options that still maintain the elegance our clients expect." Scott stepped closer, crossing his arms. "You'll probably find these easier to manage," he added, the condescension in his tone barely veiled. Chadwick's eyes flicked to the garments. While still well-made, they lacked the refinement of the suits he had first admired at the entrance. No silk linings, no intricate stitching, no bold designs. These were leftovers, the kind of stock stores held onto to sell at clearance prices to customers who didn't have the budget for new collections. He exhaled slowly, tamping down the sharp retort rising in his throat. Instead, he reached for one of the jackets, ignoring the way Lauren shifted closer as though ready to snatch it away. "I'll try this one," he said, keeping his voice even. Lauren's smile tightened. "Of course," she said, plucking the jacket from his hands with deliberate slowness. "Let me set up a fitting room for you." She walked toward the back of the store, the jacket draped over her arm as if it were something fragile and far too precious for him to handle. Scott remained behind, his gaze fixed on Chadwick. "You're not from around here, are you?" Scott asked, his tone casual but probing. Chadwick turned to him. "What makes you say that?" Scott shrugged, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Just a feeling. Most of our clients come in knowing exactly what they want. You seem a little out of your element." Chadwick met his gaze without flinching. "You'd be surprised what I'm used to." Before Scott could respond, Lauren returned and gestured toward a narrow hallway. "This way," she said, already walking ahead. The fitting room was smaller than Chadwick expected, narrow with a single mirror and a bench that seemed designed to make clients feel like they were taking up too much space. The lighting was softer than in the main showroom, but still bright enough to make imperfections glaringly obvious. Lauren hung the jacket on the hook near the mirror, stepping back as though she were presenting a work of art. "Let me know if you need a different size," she said, her voice clipped. Then, without another word, she turned and left, leaving the door slightly ajar. Chadwick closed it behind her, leaning against the cool surface for a moment before turning to face his reflection. The man staring back at him was calm on the surface, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, a flicker of frustration, the kind he had learned to mask long ago. He traced the edge of the jacket with his fingertips, feeling the smooth fabric, and wondered if it was even worth it to keep playing along. But walking away now would mean letting them win. He slipped the jacket on, adjusting the shoulders and smoothing the lapels. It fit well, though not perfectly. Still, it wasn't the jacket that bothered him. It was the weight of the words they had thrown at him since he walked through the door. Sharp, cutting words hidden behind smiles and professionalism. A muffled laugh drifted through the thin walls, pulling him out of his thoughts. He tilted his head, straining to hear. "I give it 10 minutes before he asks about financing." Scott's voice came through, low but clear. 5. Lauren replied, her words followed by another burst of laughter. Chadwick's fingers curled into fists at his sides. He forced himself to unclench them, exhaling slowly. He had faced worse than this, but that didn't make it any easier. He stepped out of the fitting room, his gaze steady as he walked back toward the showroom. Lauren and Scott were waiting near the entrance, their conversation halting as soon as they saw him. "Well?" Lauren asked, her eyes flicking over the jacket. "It's fine," Chadwick said. "I'll take it." Lauren raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure? We haven't even discussed the price yet." Scott snickered, but Chadwick ignored him. "I said I'll take it." Lauren hesitated, clearly thrown off by his confidence. Then she plastered on another smile. "I'll ring it up," she said, turning toward the register. As Chadwick followed her, Scott fell into step beside him. "You know, I have to hand it to you," Scott said. "Most people would have walked out by now." Chadwick didn't respond. "Seriously?" Scott continued, his voice dropping just enough to make it sound personal. "Takes guts to come in here dressed like that and think you can pull it off." Chadwick stopped, turning to face him. "You think this is funny?" Scott's smirk faltered. "What?" "This." Chadwick gestured around the store. "The comments, the stares, the jokes behind my back. You think it's funny?" Scott opened his mouth, but Chadwick didn't give him the chance to speak. "Because I don't," Chadwick said, his voice calm but firm. "I don't think it's funny at all." For the first time, Scott looked genuinely uncomfortable. Lauren called out from the register, breaking the moment. "Whenever you're ready." Chadwick turned and walked toward her, his steps steady. He had come here for a suit, but it was already clear this was about more than clothing. The battle had just begun. The soft chime of the cash register echoed through the boutique, yet the sound felt sharper, heavier, as though it carried the weight of the tension that had been building since the moment Chadwick stepped inside. Lauren stood behind the counter, her perfectly manicured nails tapping rhythmically against the glass surface as the scanner beeped. The faint smirk tugging at the corners of her lips told him she still wasn't taking him seriously. Scott lingered nearby, his arms crossed as he leaned against one of the display cases. Though his posture seemed relaxed, his eyes tracked Chadwick's every move like a predator sizing up its prey. Chadwick stood by the counter, his hands resting on the polished surface, but his fingers flexed involuntarily, an instinctive reaction to the storm simmering beneath his skin. He told himself to stay calm, to keep his composure, but every glance, every whispered remark gnawed at the patience he had fought so hard to maintain. Lauren folded the jacket with deliberate precision, as if mocking him with the exaggerated care she was showing for the garment. "So," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "how would you like to pay for this?" Chadwick's jaw tightened. He pulled out his wallet and handed over his card, meeting her eyes with a calmness that belied the fire smoldering behind them. Lauren took the card with the same two-fingered grip she had used earlier, like she was afraid it might soil her skin. She swiped it through the reader, and for a moment, Chadwick saw something flicker across her face. Hesitation, maybe even surprise. It passed quickly, replaced by the same smug expression she had worn since he walked in. "Just a moment," she said, turning away as though dismissing him entirely. Scott took the opportunity to slide closer. "You know," he said, his voice low, "this place isn't really for—" He stopped himself, his eyes scanning Chadwick's face for a reaction before finishing. "People who aren't ready for it." Chadwick didn't flinch. "And what exactly does that mean?" Scott shrugged. "You said it yourself, you're just looking. Most of our customers don't need to look. They already know what they want and how to pay for it. Chadwick's fingers drummed once against the counter before he forced them to stop. "I'm paying for it right now," he said evenly. "Unless there's another test I need to pass." Scott smirked, but before he could respond, Lauren returned, holding the card out between two fingers. "Your card's been declined," she said, her voice echoing across the quiet showroom. Chadwick blinked. "What?" "It was declined," Lauren repeated, louder this time. She turned the card so he could see the machine's screen, but the display was turned away. He reached for the card, but she pulled it back slightly before letting it drop onto the counter as though it burned her fingers. "Maybe you should call your bank," she added, "or maybe we can direct you to something a little more affordable." A snicker escaped from Scott. "I told you," he said under his breath. Chadwick's breath slowed, his pulse pounding in his ears. He picked up the card and stared at it for a moment before pulling out his phone. He held it up, making sure Lauren and Scott could see the banking app on the screen. "No alerts," he said. "No issues." He refreshed the page twice, showing the available balance, more than enough to buy the entire rack behind them. Lauren's smile faltered, but only slightly. "There must have been a technical error," she said quickly. "These things happen sometimes." "Run it again," Chadwick said. Lauren hesitated, then took the card and swiped it a second time. This time the machine beeped approvingly, but she didn't apologize. "Would you like a receipt emailed or printed?" she asked, her voice as cold as ever. Chadwick took the printed receipt without a word, but he wasn't finished. He turned to Scott. "I hope you got a good look," he said. Scott's smirk wavered. "Excuse me?" "You've been staring at me since I walked in here," Chadwick continued, "judging me, laughing behind my back, acting like I don't belong." Lauren straightened, stepping between them. "Sir, there's no need for this. We've completed your transaction. If you're unhappy with our service, you're welcome to file a complaint." Chadwick let out a short, humorless laugh. "A complaint? Is that what you call this? Service?" Lauren's eyes narrowed. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The words hit harder than he expected, not because he hadn't seen them coming, but because of the finality in her voice. Scott moved closer again, this time standing just a little too tall, his shoulders squared like a bouncer at a nightclub. "Or we can help you out," Scott added, gesturing toward the door. Chadwick stood his ground, his heart pounding. Every instinct screamed at him to push back, to make a scene, to let the fire inside him burn through the carefully constructed walls he had built to survive moments like this, but he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he took his phone out again and pressed record. "What are you doing?" Lauren snapped. "Documenting," Chadwick said simply. "You can't film in here." "Why not?" he asked. "You don't want people to see how you treat your customers?" Lauren reached for his phone, but he stepped back, keeping it out of her reach. "This is private property," she hissed. "And this is a public issue," Chadwick shot back, "because I'm not the first person you've treated like this, and I won't be the last. But today, it stops here." Scott's face darkened, but before he could step in, Chadwick pointed to the name tags pinned to their chests. "Smile," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel, "because I'm about to make you famous." The boutique fell silent. Lauren's mouth opened and closed as she searched for a response, but Chadwick had already turned toward the door, his phone still recording as he walked out. But he knew this wasn't over. The fire burning inside him demanded more than an exit. It demanded accountability. And he was just getting started. Chadwick stood just inside the boutique's entrance, the weight of what had just unfolded pressing down on him like a storm cloud. The soft chime of the bell above the door had already announced his presence, but now the sound felt like an alarm. It wasn't just a signal of his arrival. It was a warning, a reminder that he didn't belong here. The faint hum of whispers drifted from the far end of the showroom. He could feel the eyes of the staff boring into his back, scrutinizing every detail of his posture, his clothing, the phone still clutched in his hand. The tension that had simmered since the moment he stepped inside had now reached a boiling point. Lauren stood near the register, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. Her perfectly polished nails tapped against her forearm in a rhythm that seemed designed to fray his patience further. Scott loomed just a few feet away, his stance wide, his jaw tight. Chadwick recognized the look immediately. It was the same look he'd seen too many times before. The look of someone who thought power came from towering over another person. Chadwick took a steadying breath. He could still feel the heat of frustration simmering just beneath his skin, but he wasn't ready to let it boil over. Not yet. "You need to turn that camera off," Lauren said, her voice slicing through the silence. Chadwick met her gaze without flinching. "No." Lauren's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly masked it with a sharp inhale. "I'm serious. You can't film in here." "And I'm serious," Chadwick replied. "I have every right to record what's happening. This is evidence." Scott stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the marble floor. "Evidence of what?" he asked, his voice low and hard. "You weren't mistreated. We offered to help, and you're blowing this out of proportion." Chadwick turned the camera toward him. "Blowing it out of proportion? You followed me, mocked me, and treated me like a criminal the moment I walked through the door. And now, because I'm not backing down, you're trying to intimidate me." Scott's jaw twitched, and for a moment it looked like he might step forward again. But Lauren held out a hand, stopping him. "Sir, you've made your point," she said, her voice strained but still clinging to the last shreds of professionalism. "Now I need you to leave." Chadwick didn't move. "I'm not going anywhere." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. He saw the flicker of panic in Lauren's eyes, the brief moment where her mask slipped, and she realized this wasn't going to end the way she'd planned. "Call security," she said, her voice sharp. Scott smirked, pulling out his phone and tapping quickly. "Already did." Chadwick's grip on his phone tightened, but he stayed rooted in place. He wasn't about to be bullied out the door, not after everything they'd put him through. "Do you even hear yourselves?" he said, his voice rising slightly. "You treated me like dirt from the second I walked in here. You assumed I couldn't afford to be here. You assumed I was trying to steal from you, and now you're calling security because I'm standing my ground?" Lauren's cheeks flushed, but she didn't back down. "You're disturbing our other customers." "There are no other customers," Chadwick interrupted, his voice sharp. "You made sure of that when you started treating me like a threat the moment I walked in." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Scott hesitated, his phone still clutched in his hand. Then the door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered man in a security uniform stepped inside. He paused, taking in the scene before fixing his eyes on Chadwick. "Is there a problem here?" the guard asked, his voice level but commanding. Lauren stepped forward immediately. "Yes, there is," she said. "This man refuses to leave the premises after multiple requests." "That's not true," Chadwick said, turning the camera toward the guard. I came here to buy a suit. That's it. And instead, I've been harassed, insulted, and now they're trying to force me out." The guard hesitated, his eyes flicking between Chadwick and Lauren. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step outside so we can resolve this." Chadwick stared at him. "Resolve this?" he repeated. "You mean remove me so they don't have to face the consequences of what they've done?" "Sir." "No," Chadwick said, his voice firm. "Not this time." The guard stepped closer, his posture shifting into something more forceful. Chadwick felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders, the knowledge that he was one wrong move away from becoming the villain in their story. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm even as the guard reached for his arm. "You don't need to do this," Chadwick said, but the guard didn't stop. Chadwick stumbled back a step as the guard's grip tightened, his phone slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. The sound seemed to snap something inside him. "No!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "You don't get to treat me like this." Lauren flinched at the outburst, and even Scott took a step back, but the guard held firm. "Sir, you need to leave, now." Chadwick's chest heaved, but he didn't resist as the guard pulled him toward the door. His voice dropped to a low, steady tone as he looked Lauren in the eye one last time. "This isn't over," he said. And then he was outside, the door slamming shut behind him. For a moment, he just stood there, his heart racing as the heat of the confrontation lingered in his veins. People passing by glanced at him curiously, but he didn't care. He bent down, picking up his phone and checking the screen. The recording was still there. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Chadwick stood on the sidewalk just outside the boutique's gleaming glass doors, the reflection of the showroom's opulence mirrored faintly behind him. His pulse still pounded in his ears, his breath coming in slow, measured draws as he worked to steady himself. The door had slammed shut with a finality that felt almost theatrical, and yet, as he stood there gripping his phone, Chadwick knew the curtain hadn't fallen. Not yet. Pedestrians passed by, sparing him quick, curious glances, some pausing long enough to recognize him before hurrying along as if they were afraid to involve themselves in whatever drama was unfolding. The security guard stood on the other side of the glass now, his broad figure just visible through the reflection, stationed like a sentinel to ensure Chadwick didn't come back inside. But Chadwick wasn't leaving. He bent down and checked his phone, his fingers moving over the screen with a practiced ease. The video recording was still intact, 11 minutes and 32 seconds of raw footage documenting every insult, every hostile glance, every thinly veiled dismissal. He tapped the replay button, and the sound of Lauren's sharp voice filled the air. "You don't belong here." It wasn't those exact words. No, she'd been more subtle, more careful, but the intent had been just as clear. Chadwick felt the anger begin to rise again, but this time it didn't feel uncontrollable. It felt focused. He turned slightly, angling the camera toward the boutique sign and capturing the pristine lettering above the doors. The name alone carried weight, synonymous with exclusivity, luxury, and power. And now it carried something else. Evidence. Behind the glass, Scott appeared, leaning close to Lauren as they stared out at him. Lauren's arms were folded tightly, her eyes darting nervously from Chadwick to the phone in his hand. Scott gestured sharply, his expression no longer smug but strained. They knew. Chadwick watched as Lauren grabbed her phone and began dialing. He couldn't hear her, but he didn't need to. She was panicking. The controlled, icy demeanor she had maintained inside the store had started to crack. He smoothed his shirt and straightened his shoulders, taking one step closer to the door. just enough to make her flinch. Then, as if to emphasize the point, he lifted his phone and pressed the screen. Live. The word appeared in the corner of the screen, and Chadwick turned the camera toward himself. "Hey, everyone," he began, his voice steady. "I want to share something that just happened." The comments started pouring in almost immediately. Names, emojis, waves of greetings and questions as viewers tuned in. But Chadwick didn't pause. "I walked into this boutique about 30 minutes ago to buy a suit. That's it. I wanted to find something nice for an event I'm speaking at later this week. A charity gala, actually." He turned the phone, panning over the store's window and the security guard inside. But instead, this is what happened. The guard shifted uneasily as the camera passed over him. Behind him, Lauren and Scott had vanished deeper into the store, but Chadwick wasn't finished. "They profiled me," he continued, turning the camera back to himself. "They assumed that because of how I was dressed, or maybe because of how I looked, I couldn't afford to be here. They treated me like I didn't belong, like I was a problem they needed to deal with instead of a customer they should have respected." The comments were coming faster now, expressions of outrage, disbelief, and frustration. Chadwick paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "This isn't just about me," he said finally. "This is about what happens to people every single day in places like this, and it's about time we start holding them accountable." He ended the stream and exhaled slowly. Behind the glass, the boutique seemed to come alive with movement. The guard stepped away from the door, disappearing into the back, and Chadwick knew exactly what was happening. They were calling someone higher up the chain. Good. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb a few minutes later, and Chadwick recognized the man who stepped out. Max Patterson, regional director of the boutique chain. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit, his polished shoes clicking softly against the pavement as he hurried toward the door. Max's eyes met Chadwick's briefly before he stepped inside. From where Chadwick stood, he could see the way Lauren's shoulders tensed as Max approached her. Scott seemed to shrink back, suddenly unsure of himself now that real authority had arrived. It didn't take long. The door opened again, and Max stepped outside, his face set in an expression of forced calm. "Mr. Boseman," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Max Patterson. I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Chadwick didn't take the hand. Instead, he folded his arms and waited. Max cleared his throat, his smile faltering. "First, let me apologize for what happened here today. This is absolutely not how we do business, and I assure you—" "Stop," Chadwick interrupted, his voice sharp. "I don't want rehearsed apologies, Max. I want accountability." Max blinked. "Of course," he said quickly. "We're taking this very seriously." "Are you?" Chadwick asked, stepping closer. "Because it didn't seem that way when I was being insulted, harassed, and thrown out of your store. And I've got the footage to prove it." Max's eyes darted to the phone in Chadwick's hand. "I understand," he said, "and I'll personally oversee an internal review. We'll make this right." "Making it right doesn't mean sweeping it under the rug," Chadwick shot back. "It means consequences. It means retraining your staff, or replacing them. And it means having this conversation publicly, not behind closed doors." Max's smile was gone now. He looked past Chadwick as if searching for an escape, but the growing crowd of onlookers ensured there was none. Chadwick's voice softened, but only slightly. "You want to fix this? Start by admitting what it is. Racism, bias, disrespect. Own it, and then do better." Max hesitated, but then he nodded. "You're right," he said quietly. "We need to do better." The tension lingered, but Chadwick could feel the balance shifting. The boutique, the staff, even Max, they were no longer in control. He stepped back, lowering his phone, but his eyes stayed locked on Max. "This isn't over," Chadwick said. And he meant it. The boutique's glass doors closed behind Max Patterson, but the weight of the confrontation lingered like smoke. Chadwick stood his ground, his phone lowered now, but his shoulders squared and steady. The murmurs of onlookers outside the store buzzed faintly, and though the crowd had thinned, a few curious faces still hovered nearby, phones in hand, recording remnants of the fallout. Inside, the once silent boutique bustled with uneasy movement. Lauren and Scott were huddled near the register, their expressions taut with panic and humiliation. The air no longer carried the pristine polish of exclusivity and luxury. Instead, it felt heavy, stained by the echoes of their earlier hostility. Chadwick let the tension breathe for a moment longer before he stepped back through the door, the soft chime overhead ringing hollow this time. Max, who had retreated to the center of the showroom, turned immediately, straightening as Chadwick approached. The regional director's earlier veneer of corporate charm was gone, replaced by something more subdued, uncertainty wrapped in the remnants of authority. "Mr. Boseman," Max began, his voice steady but low. "We've asked the staff to gather in the conference room. I think it's important we address this situation directly." Chadwick nodded once but said nothing. He followed Max through the showroom, past gleaming glass cases and rows of suits that now felt more like symbols of exclusion than status. The polished floors that had once seemed designed to intimidate now amplified each step he took, as if declaring that silence was no longer an option. The conference room sat at the back of the boutique, a sleek space enclosed by glass walls. Inside, the employees had already taken their seats around a long, gleaming table. Lauren and Scott sat near the end, their postures stiff, their gazes fixed downward. A few other staff members, associates who had been lingering in the background earlier, shifted nervously in their chairs. Max gestured towards the head of the table. "Please," he said, "have a seat." Chadwick didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer to the table, letting the weight of his presence fill the space. "I'll stand," he said. Max hesitated but then nodded and took a seat at the far end of the table, folding his hands in front of him like a man preparing to deliver a verdict. Chadwick let his eyes sweep across the room, pausing just long enough to meet each person's gaze. Lauren flinched under his stare, but Scott looked up, his expression a mix of defensiveness and guilt. "This isn't easy," Chadwick began, his voice calm but firm, "and it's not supposed to be." The room fell completely silent. Even Max seemed to shrink slightly, as though bracing for what was to come. "When I walked through those doors today, I didn't come here looking for a fight," Chadwick continued. "I came here looking for a suit for an event that's meant to raise money for cancer research, an event that's supposed to be about hope and progress." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But instead of being treated like a customer, I was treated like a threat. I was judged, not for who I am, but for what I looked like. And that judgment wasn't subtle. It wasn't hidden." His eyes locked on Lauren. "It was right here, in the way you spoke to me, in the way you took that jacket out of my hands, in the way you called security instead of asking how you could help." Lauren's cheeks flushed, and her hands fidgeted in her lap. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but Chadwick held up a hand. "I'm not finished." Her lips snapped shut. He turned to Scott next. "And you," Chadwick said. "You thought this was funny. You made jokes. You stood there and watched while your manager treated me like I didn't belong, and you joined in." Scott looked away, his jaw tightening. "This isn't about one bad experience," Chadwick said, his voice rising slightly. "It's about a culture. One that tells people like me that no matter how successful we are, no matter what we've accomplished, we'll always have to prove we deserve to be here." He paused, letting the silence settle before continuing. "But I don't need to prove anything to you." Lauren shifted in her seat, and this time when she looked up, there was something different in her expression. Remorse, or maybe fear. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Chadwick didn't let her off the hook so easily. "Sorry for what?" he asked. "Sorry that you got caught? Sorry that I turned on the camera and didn't let you get away with it?" Lauren flinched again, but this time she didn't look away. "No," she said, "I'm sorry for how I treated you. I was wrong, and I know that now." Chadwick studied her for a moment before shifting his focus back to the room. "Apologies are a start," he said, "but they're not enough, not anymore." He looked at Max. "You said you wanted to fix this, so let's start with accountability." Max straightened. "We'll be implementing immediate training for the entire staff," he said, "not just here, but at every location in the region. And I'll personally oversee—" "Training is good," Chadwick interrupted, "but what about consequences?" Max hesitated. "Because if there aren't consequences," Chadwick continued, "then this doesn't mean anything. It's just words, and I'm not here for words." Max nodded slowly. "We'll review the actions of each staff member involved and determine appropriate disciplinary measures. I promise you, this won't be ignored." Chadwick's eyes moved back to Lauren and Scott. "I hope you understand what today meant," he said, "because this isn't just about you. It's about everyone who walks through those doors after me. And if you're not ready to treat them with the same respect you give someone in a suit and tie, then you don't deserve to be here." Scott swallowed hard and nodded. Lauren murmured another apology. Chadwick stepped back, his shoulders still squared but the fire in his chest starting to cool. "This isn't over," he said one last time, "but it's a start." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving the staff to sit with their discomfort. As he stepped back into the showroom, the tension that had hung in the air began to dissipate. The boutique no longer felt untouchable. It felt human, flawed and exposed, but perhaps capable of change. Chadwick glanced one last time at his reflection in the glass. He saw not just himself, but the faces of every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. And as he stepped back into the sunlight, he knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something bigger. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss